All right, Adam, welcome to the podcast today.
Thank you for having me.
I am looking forward to learning about geek therapy, nerd therapy.
Well, it's nerd counseling. If you ask the person that runs the group practice that I'm with, it's Geek Therapy is what it's actually called. But
Okay.
he every time I correct him, he just is like, "Yeah, nerd counseling." I'm like, "Sure, close enough."
Okay. So geek therapy is
Geek Therapy.
is what you do. Um, I'm intrigued about how you discovered this or became involved in it. So could you share your background with listeners?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am currently doing both full-time work at Columbia River Mental Health here in Vancouver, Washington, a community mental health agency. I also am doing some private practice stuff on the side, trying to turn that into trying to turn my side hustle into my full-time job. And so I get to use some of this geek therapy stuff in the community mental health setting, but I'm really looking forward to being able to have a lot more control over what the process looks like in private practice, because there's just a lot of really cool stuff that you can do. And in community mental health, they're not always flexible enough for that.
Mm.
So yeah, so in addition to the geek therapy stuff, I specialize in things, a lot of stuff that has to do with like identity and contacting your core values and like figuring out like what's important to you versus what people have always told you is important, but if you're honest with yourself, you don't actually believe it. So as a result, like my specialties tend to revolve around things like career development, identity, life transitions, and spiritual issues. Kind of four big categories where it's important to be able to like know what's actually important to you, like what's really getting you out of bed in the morning, and why you keep doing what you do. Because research shows that's where life satisfaction is. It's not about being happy all the time. It's about being satisfied with what you're doing. It's actually really interesting, this sort of just coming at it from the spiritual perspective. The longer that I do therapy, the more convinced I become that when they talk about joy in the Bible, that what they're actually talking about is what acceptance and commitment therapy would call values-oriented action, or like the resilience that pops up when we are pursuing things that are authentically valuable or meaningful to us.
Ooh, so slow down. That's good stuff. So so joy, um, connected to our values and taking action.
Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, there's one of the basic premises of acceptance and commitment therapy is that the overall, like, pain is not the equivalent of suffering. Like, suffering is pain without cause. As long as the pain is in service of something that we genuinely believe in, something that we think is meaningful or satisfying, then our resilience just grows exponentially. Like, the person that's at the dead-end job that hates what they're doing, hates going into work, complains more than Paul did, even though Paul got imprisoned multiple times, because Paul had that joy. He had that resilience that just shows up when we're doing things that are important or meaningful to us. Whereas the guy at the dead-end job doesn't have any kind of buffer.
Yeah, but even in not just a dead end job, but I think a lot of folks, even in jobs that pay really well and have really good benefits, if it seems meaningless and purposeless, or if you're in a company, you don't buy into their values or what their mission is, you can be miserable, even though um I've worked with a lot of folks where they're like, I can't complain. Why am I depressed? why am I unhappy? Right?
Right.
I'm successful.
Yeah. And in the sort of the essence of depression, especially that like long lasting depression that turns into like an actual disorder, like the major depressive disorder type of stuff, so much of that stems from this long-term experience of pain without cause, without meaning. And the sort of like, I don't know, existential angst and dread that comes from being in pain for a long time for no good reason. There's a, it seems strange to quote Nietzsche in a, at least semi-Christian podcast, but he has this really cool quote that I like. It's like, a man of sufficient why can bear any amount of how. And yeah, so, and that is actually one of the things that got me into doing geek therapy is once I started digging into like what values look like in the counseling office, I started noticing that there's a lot of things that don't fit into these traditional structures. Like when we talk about values, we talk about like family, religion, even financial security, things like that, which can be values. Like all of those things are super important. But then, the guy that quits the well-paying job to start a YouTube channel where he like opens kids' toys and plays with them, like that doesn't fit into any of those categories. But if the guy's still doing it, if he's making money doing it, if he's good and invested in it, like there's a value at work there. And like the sort of the essence of geek therapy and like why I got into it is this like recognition I have that there's this huge untapped well of things, like especially in regards to pop culture, that we haven't explored as being at the very least like indicative of where our values are. Like there was so I was introduced to this idea. There was a person that worked at Columbia River who was running a group therapy using Dungeons and Dragons as a medium, and was like doing things like working on like formal therapy stuff like cognitive distortions and like a lot of the stuff you run into in like CBT work, cognitive behavioral therapy work. And it was like a resounding success. Like everybody that went through that group, it was just like this huge deal. And there were people that up until that point were more or less like treatment resistant in therapy. They were having these major breakthroughs. And like that combined with, and it's a thing that I can get into in a little bit, I had this one anime that I started like the summer that my son was born. So that was last year. And like the second episode of this show, I'm just like curled up on the ground, like crying at this one scene. And I'm like, why is this affecting me so much? And like, I just dug into it. Like I dug into like, what is it about this scene? What is it? Because like, it's satisfying something in me, because it was like a cathartic kind of crying. It wasn't sadness. It was like just that something in me that I didn't even know was really weighing on me, just kind of like lifted watching this character experience this thing. And the more I dug into it, the more I'm like, oh, well, I like relate to that part of the experience, and I relate to that part of his experience, and I relate to that part of his experience. And this resolution that he experienced in this episode ended up being something that I didn't know that I had always wanted in my own life. And there was just this profound recognition that even if things don't fit into these traditional categories, the things that we love are the things that we devote our time to. They represent some important part of us, or we wouldn't be devoting so much time to them. And so rather than making them translate their experience into therapy speak, I decided, why not try to do it the other way around? Like, what if instead of doing a role play where I'm like, oh, I'm going to be your dad here, how would you say this? Like, how about we do an actual role playing game? Because that's language they already understand. They don't have to learn anything new. It uses skills and abilities and understandings and vocabulary that's already there.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, just building on where they're at, and
yeah,
and the way they see and understand the world. Let me take a step back. Because when I was growing up in the 70s, being a nerd, being a geek, that was like the worst thing that you could happen. That's the worst thing that you could be called. But now it's like people are embracing it. But for maybe for listeners who are like not sure what you mean, but by geek therapy or nerd counseling, can you explain more about that?
Yeah. So probably good to start off with sort of getting an operational definition of what a geek is. So really, like, at its core, a geek is anyone who is like incredibly passionate about one or more things. Like, this is the thing that's on their mind. Like, it's a part of their world. Like, if there's a person that's like, even if they don't like the job that they're at, they're working so that they can finance the thing that they're doing off the clock that they're really into. That person is a geek. And there are certain things that certainly they get labeled as geeky more frequently. So comic books, for instance, nice shirt. Comic books, for instance, certainly something that people associate with this geekiness. And, if you've ever met somebody that's into comic books, man, they are into comic books. Like, there's not a middle ground where you're just like kind of sort of into comics. You're either like, I've seen 2 of the 3 Iron Man movies, or it's, oh, well, yeah, like if we ever do like a trivia night or something, I do know Tony Stark's middle name.
Yeah. These are the folks. I may include myself. You're going to the midnight showings when the Marvel movies come out.
Yeah, no, absolutely, 100%. And it's interesting because there's also a culture that is formed up around geekiness, and it's this really cool little switch, because back in the 70s, for instance, like, geek was sort of a way that you labeled someone as an outsider. Now it's actually a name that you attribute to people that have found community through these shared passions. And so there is like this cultural element. And I would say that that's like a good half of geek therapy, is just like being culturally competent in speaking geek. Like, you don't have to necessarily know everything about every comic book, anime, video game character, but like having a knowledge of like, what is a role-playing game? What is a MOBA?
What is a MOBA?
Okay, so MOBA is a multiplayer online battle arena. This would be like League of Legends, where you have like one character. That Overwatch is also.
Is that like Fortnite?
I haven't played Fortnite, so it's hard for me to say for sure, but my vibe is yes.
Is where you have a team of people.
So yeah, so it's kind of a spectrum here. So normally a MOBA is usually, in my understanding, it's typified by the fact that you are playing like as a character that has their own like specific abilities and whatnot. Like, usually there's like a mythos or a mythology associated with it. So like in Overwatch, for instance, you have, watch me reach the end of my knowledge of Overwatch very quickly. But like, you have this whole, like, there's been this ongoing war, and these fighters were sort of on opposite sides. Some of them weren't involved at all. Like, these characters all have stories, they have names, they have specific abilities that they have when you play as them. So that would be a MOBA. Is there's usually like a story attached to the character that you're playing as. It's not just you.
Yeah. The so like there's a plot to these games.
Yes.
Well, like we were saying earlier about purpose and meaning. At least in the game, there's like some purpose and meaning and a mission.
For sure, you're participating in the story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The so I'm taking notes. So comic books, anime, role playing games or video games. Are there any other elements that you think are like significant to like geek culture?
Yeah, and it's interesting because like you can, I mean, I have one client right now that I would call a sailing geek. Like, this dude goes home and reads books on different types of knots and like how different qualities of cloth for your sails can affect like your top speed versus like how quickly you can get going. And like I would say that guy is a sailing geek. And so and that's where kind of the second element of this comes in. So whereas the first half is sort of just cultural competency and geek speak, the second half of it is this sort of just this approach of saying that like anything that you put that much time into is a strength. We might have to figure out how, but anything that you put that much time into is a strength. And if you're doing it consistently, it brings you joy, then there is a value that you have that is at play there. Otherwise, it wouldn't have that kind of hold over you.
That's an interesting way of framing that, because like I'm guessing some parents, many parents, anything you put so much time into, man, son, you're putting 12 hours a day into this game, or like that that is a negative in our home, but you're framing it as a strength.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And anything can be elevated to a problematic level, right? Like if you're calling out of work and this is like the 6th time that you've done it and you're about to get disciplined because you were up all night playing World of Warcraft or whatever, then we're creeping over into problematic territory with that kind of thing. But even then, there is something important that you're getting out of that, like something that lights you up. Otherwise, you probably wouldn't be doing it. And so, like, for instance, so going off of like the Overwatch example, if you're putting 10 hours a day into playing Overwatch, that's the one that you're really into, and you're not actually even trying to get on any kind of like leaderboard or any of that. You just you like that your friends are playing, and you know that no one wants to be a support character like Mercy. So a character that doesn't have a lot of combat ability, but it can act as like a healer or something like that for the characters that are doing the damage. Think kind of like a field medic. Then like there is potentially something to explore in there of like how you view yourself, the way that you relate to the rest of the world. Like if you play healers in games, which healers are kind of like the bass players of the video game universe, like very few people actually want to do it, but it's absolutely necessary for a functioning band. And you don't get a lot of credit even when you do really, really good work. Like name 10 bass players. Actually, if you're really into music, I don't know if you are, you probably could name 10 bass players. Most people can't. But like, again, going back to what I said before, that with Geek Therapy, there's some part of us that is represented by the thing that we are doing, something in us that is being satisfied, an itch that's being scratched. And in, the example that I just gave, wanting to be a support to other people, but not necessarily knowing how to do that in real life. And so this is where you get that.
Yeah, I can understand the appeal of that. When you were describing the Mercy character or those type medic types, I'm like, what Enneagram number is that?
Yeah, right.
Sounds like a 2. That sounds like a helper.
I've actually been going through and giving Enneagrams to a bunch of different fictional characters, just trying to get a good conceptualization. I've also been doing a couple of treatment plans for villains. That was a really fun exercise. Helps me get into that mindset of, incorporating that kind of stuff into therapy.
Yeah.
I did Demona from Gargoyles. That one was fun.
The one of the themes of my my final paper in seminary was on origin stories, and how much people the appeal of superheroes and now superhero movies. When I graduated, only the first X-Men movie had come out. So
my deepest condolences.
So it's a great time to be alive now, though.
For sure.
Yeah. But I wrote about Tony Stark and his alcoholism from the comic books, and the themes of identity that come up, and the masks that we wear. But this was before the first Iron Man movie came out. So you can it's been a lot of fun to see all these stories play out now, and it's not even fringe or weird anymore. It's pretty mainstream to enjoy Marvel movies.
Yeah, and that's another huge part of one of the reasons that I've wanted to get into the geek therapy thing is, we're required to be culturally competent in all of these different areas. Why not this one? There is a culture associated with it. There's traditions, there's norms, there's vocabulary, there are actual dialects. If you speak meme and a person that has never gotten on the internet is talking to you, you sound like you've had a stroke. I Can Has Cheeseburger, one of the classic ones. That sounds insane to people that have not looked at a lot of cat memes on the internet.
I have to ask my daughter to translate for me.
Yeah. Well, and this is you bring up a really interesting point too, that a lot of the interest that I've had when I've talked about this with people is actually not from the individuals themselves, but with parents, people that are, and this is where the cultural competency piece comes in, just the sheer number of parents that I talk to that are yeah, my kid's super into that. I have no idea what it is, no matter how often they explain it to me. And it's very vast, it's diverse, it's complex, it's deep. Any individual one of these things, you can get so far, far, far into it. There is, so for instance, calculating the likelihood of being able to catch a specific Pokemon in a Pokemon game. This is Gengar. This one's my favorite. There's literally a calculus equation that you can do to determine the percentage chance that you're going to catch this Pokemon given the information that you know. And there are people that know it. I know one person that can recite it from memory. You can get so deep into any of these things. And so it's necessary for there to be people that have at least a surface level understanding of what all of these things are.
What would you say, Adam, are then the downsides to being a geek or geek culture, and then how does this show up in counseling?
Yeah, so there's good question. So despite the fact that all of these things have become a lot more mainstream recently, it's still like the deeper you get into any particular passion, the more likely you are to sort of feel like an outcast or an outsider, because like you devote so much time to doing this thing that the average person doesn't do. And so by design, I mean, even therapists experience this, and literally our job is talking to people. But like, how often have you felt isolated because people don't understand what it's like for a therapist to be doing this stuff?
Right.
And so like you
So
run
true.
the risk, yeah. And so like you run the risk of feeling like an outsider. And in fact, a lot of these geekier things tend to, so the shonen style animes, so that would be Dragon Ball Z, My Hero Academia, Naruto, a lot of the more popular mainstream animes in the States anyway. A lot of those tend to appeal to people that feel like social outcasts, because the shonen anime trope, like shonen animes are sort of typified by there is this lead character that is different than everybody else, and throughout the course of the series they find ways to take the thing that made them alienated and turn it into a strength. You know, with Naruto, it was mastering the demon that had gotten sealed inside him that had made everyone afraid of him. For you know, in My Hero Academia, Midoriya, the main character, it was like the anxiety driven this like anxiety driven like forward thinking and like planning ability that he developed as a result of trying to be a superhero and not having any superpowers. Like when he actually does gain a superpower, like that becomes, rather than a thing that was debilitating for him, it became a strength. Like the ability to, like he even says in one of the episodes, like, I noticed all of these things because you were too amazing to have to care about them. And
that's such a good metaphor for ADD.
oh, 100%. So I alluded earlier to a experience that I had watching a TV show, and that was that one. And you hit the nail on the head, because I identified with this character because it feels like the story of every person with ADHD. Like that was the thing that ultimately like really got to me was, you know, this character, he has like, and like, this is the part that I really identified with, was like, I always wanted to be a helper. Like that was even 6th, 7th grade. Like I distinctly remember, you know, sitting with my friend that had just like been on the receiving end of some bullying, and like helping him talk through the process and telling him that it's not him, and like all of those things. Like I always wanted to be that, but I also had these attentional difficulties that can make it difficult to attune with people, that can make it difficult to stay silent and give them the space to talk. Fun fact about ADHD, the reason that a lot of them tend to be chatty is that the working memory deficits don't apply to verbal processing. And so as long as we're talking, we can stay on task as though we don't have ADHD. Then when we stop talking, we go back to not being able to hold the information. So what I identified with this character was, he had a lot of these strengths that he had developed. And then, you know, him receiving the superpower, like I felt this like deep visceral connection with his experience versus when I first started taking Adderall. And like all of a sudden I could get my brain to do the things that I needed it to do. I could just sit and listen to people. And like the catharsis that this character experienced when, after he had put so much effort into learning how to be a superhero so that he could save people. Like he didn't want to be great, he didn't want to be famous. He literally, that was his thing, is he wanted to save people. and always struggled with feeling powerless to do that because he did not have a superpower. And so when he finally gets that superpower and gets the opportunity to be the person that he always wanted to be, like, it's just, you know, like I said, I was on my living room floor just like sobbing. And that was one of the things that prompted me to start looking into this. This is sort of like helping us identify like what our values are, like what our experiences are, these important aspects of ourselves that we don't always have contact with, like identifying those through the things that we're into, because some part of us is represented in those things. Like My Hero Academia is one of my favorite animes because I related so much to that character. And I loved that character, and I had this visceral emotional response before I ever knew why. And like digging into those things as a means of self-exploration, as a way of understanding the world in a way that's intuitive to us instead of having to translate it to normie.
Yeah, yeah. Wow, that's so powerful. My Hero Academia, the first one, the Naruto with the demon that makes other people scared of him. That like that like to me, like so many of my clients, that's what anger does in their
Yeah,
lives.
yeah,
Makes them powerful, but makes them alone because people are scares people off, or
yeah,
bad things happen
yeah.
with that. And yeah, that's uh w- w- are those animes a good place to start for someone who's interested in learning more
Yeah,
about it?
yeah. So there's sort of a one of the things that I like about these shonen animes is that they do a very good job of engendering complex reactions with simple storytelling things. Like it's very I don't know if you've ever read Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis, but you know how you had to go back and you had to read every page like 5 or 6 times to understand what he was saying because it was
I
so dense.
the first time I tried to read it was I was like 11. I was
Oh
like,
God.
man, this is challenging.
Yeah. And like shonen animes are kind of the opposite in the way that they can convey these complex themes through very simple means. And so there's a couple of them that can be very hold on just a second, I need to go to the bathroom.
Sure. All right, we're back for part 2. And so Adam, you're sharing how uh, uh, geek, being a geek about something, whether it's sailing or anime, can be a strength, but it also can lead to someone feeling outcast, or an outsider. Um, can you share a little bit more about what's unique about geek therapy compared to the other ones that you mentioned earlier, like acceptance and commitment therapy or cognitive behavioral therapy?
Yeah. And yeah, it's an interesting question because it's one of those things that is a truth is convergent. Good therapy and like a really good therapy technique is going to share some things in common with another really good therapy technique. And like it's interesting because geek therapy, it's almost like there's a lot of openness. There's like, actually, here's how I'll put it. They hit a lot on the philosophy of like why this particular style of therapy is important and like what the rationale behind it is. And by digging into the like abstract parts of it, it actually leaves like a lot of creative freedom for taking a other styles of therapy and incorporating this into it. Like it's not even necessarily trying to be its own discrete set of techniques. It's more of it pulls from a lot of different areas. And actually, the closest thing that geek therapy has to a manual, it's written by a guy named Anthony Bean. I have it around here somewhere. It was here. Ah, this book.
Cool.
It talks a lot about what geek therapy looks like in all of these different therapy styles. Like if you are an acceptance and commitment therapist, here's what it looks like to incorporate this geek therapy philosophy into it. And yeah, it's rooted in this idea that loving things that much to that degree is a strength and is indicative of some important part of you. And that by definition, and this is where it goes really well with the acceptance and commitment therapy stuff. By definition, the things that you're geeky about, they have blood going to them. Like this isn't a prescribed set of like rules for healthy living. Like it's not a, this is what a person should enjoy or what they should like. It's like, you love this thing. And I don't think that you would love it if it wasn't important or it wasn't satisfying some deep part of you in some way. So let's dig into what that is and figure out how to get that into these other areas of your life. So like an example, you have a client that's coming in that has a lot of identity issues. They're feeling like they, the person that they are versus the person that they want to be or that they expect themselves to be, that these things aren't matching up. So one of the things that you can do is you can have them, so in Dungeons and Dragons, you tend to write like your stats, your abilities, your character class, like are you a wizard, are you a fighter or a rogue, something like that. You write these things down on a character sheet that has all of these different boxes for that information. And so what you can do is you can have somebody, it's like, okay, well, what does fantasy you look like? Like as you are right now, like what are your flaws? What are your abilities? Just like translated into fantasy world speak. And then you have them make a character sheet for the person that they want to be. And there's a lot of really interesting, it almost feels like art therapy more than anything else. It's
Sounds
a lot
very
of
creative.
Yeah. So what you do is you like leave it up to the client, like, okay, so you have this character that you are and this character that you want to be. Well, in Dungeons and Dragons, you have what's called multi-classing. So if the character that they are is like this super isolated, socially avoidant rogue, keeps to themselves, does a good job, but can't really relate to other people, prefers to work alone. But what they want to be is the bard, the super charismatic support character, the one that makes everybody laugh, the one that, is super flirty, super outgoing, musically talented. So in Dungeons and Dragons, you have this thing called multi-classing. So you can be a bard and a rogue. So what you do is you take the ideal person, that character sheet, and then the thing that they are, and then you combine those two things. So if you are a level 3 rogue and you want to be a level 3 bard, then you have them multi-class, you have them be a level 3 rogue and a level 3 bard. And then you have them take the first character sheet and you have them create a story of how this character got from being a level 3 rogue to being a level 3 rogue and a level 3 bard. Like you have them go through the steps, and it's just an interesting, like almost art therapy reskin of just like a solutions focused thing of like magic bullet question, what do you want to be different? Then let's reverse engineer the steps to get there.
Yeah. How does that play out? But I like that, because a lot of times when people go to counseling, they're trying to problem solve or figure out like, how do I change my behavior? But what you just described, multi-class, is what steps do I need to take to become who I want to be?
Yeah.
And the qualities, the different traits or characteristics. And you see it in behaviors, but it's more about identity.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I it you can pass on this question, but like I'm having so much fun hearing you describe this. Um, for you, who uh who are you becoming? Like who are you aspiring to be these days?
Yeah, that one's a good one. Um, I've always joked that I'm a Slytherin that's desperately trying to be a Hufflepuff. Uh, yeah, I mean,
Say more. I just watched Harry Potter in the last 2 years, Adam.
oh, okay,
So
perfect.
but say more. Say more about that.
So Slytherins are they they have a very like Enneagram 4 kind of energy about them. It's like very there's that kind of emotional volatility. There's the
Hmm.
like fierce loyalty to your friend group, but you're kind of willing to do whatever to get what you need out of everybody else. There's not not just not caring about the rules, but like actively going against them simply because they are rules. um, and those things can be good. Those things can give you a perspective that other people don't tend to have. Those are, those are your revolutionary types. But Voldemort was a revolutionary, just wasn't a good one. So like there's my inner Hufflepuff, the part of me that I'm trying to find is the person that like, and I guess I'm trying to be both at the same time, which I guess goes with the character class thing. Like my inner Hufflepuff is the person that like their primary value is kindness, people like harmony, people getting along. There's making other people feel seen and heard, and like what they're experiencing matters.
Mm.
And
That's like a sweet job description for a therapist.
oh, for sure. And it's a thing that like me as a therapist, like using a personal example, like for me the Slytherin trying to be a Hufflepuff is good shorthand. Like if I went through it, I'm like, okay, here's all of the steps that I'm like what I'm trying to do, who I'm trying to be, like here's the list of 50 things that I wish was different about me. Or I could just say, am I being a Hufflepuff or a Slytherin right now?
Yeah.
It's so much easier to remember.
Oh yeah. So it I see. Yeah, like the shorthand.
Yeah.
Like it's just this shared understanding
Yeah.
of story, and who people are, like identity.
Yeah, exactly.
Characteristics. Yeah.
And and again, that's what I was talking about with like geek is a culture now, because like those are words that are nonsense to people that have never been exposed to Harry Potter, but people that are in the Harry Potter fandom are like, yep, I got it, no explanation needed, I know exactly where you're at and what you're trying to do. Like and like it just seems a shame that we don't capitalize on that enough in therapy.
I use way too many Star Wars and Lord of the Rings. I need to expand my my toolbox.
Yeah. No, thank God that in this particular circumstance, this was a phone session, because I had a client that's super into Star Trek. Well, like Star Trek and Battlestar Galactica are just like the two nerd things that completely fell off my radar. Like I consider myself to be pretty versatile. Like, if you look behind me here, you'll see, so like this is a signed print of a Magic the Gathering card. This is a Pokemon in sunglasses. This is a brain cell. Like that's Dr. Manhattan from The Watchmen. Like I'm pretty versatile. But Star Trek and Battlestar Galactica, just I never got into them. I didn't think that they were bad. I just literally never got into them. And
You can
so
only
like,
be obsessed about so many things.
yeah, especially when you're working like 1.5 jobs like I am right now.
Mhm. Yeah.
But the so this client, he is super into Star Trek. We find out later, and I had a pretty good vibe pretty early on that this was the case, but mild autism spectrum. The artist formerly known as Asperger's. So he's super into Star Trek, like loved it, loved everything about it, wrote fan fiction about it. Like this was his thing, his one and only fixation, as you tend to find with a lot of people on the spectrum. And so he's describing all of this stuff. And, you know, again, thank God I'm on the phone with this client instead of doing like video or in person, because I'm just like sitting there pouring through the Star Trek wiki, just like translating in real time what this guy is saying to me. And we actually had a really cool intervention because like I know a little bit, just enough. I asked him who his favorite Star Trek captain is because I actually like know some of those. At least I know Kirk, Picard, and you know, Janeway, I think. And so I'm like, so who's your favorite Star Trek captain? He's like, oh, Picard, obviously. It's like, sure, obviously. I was like, okay, so here's what I want you to do. Because he was having difficulty communicating with his family, setting boundaries, that type of thing. I'm like, I want you to assign the Star Trek race that you think most resembles these family members to each family member. And then I want you to write fan fiction about Picard brokering a peace deal between all of these people. And he did it. And through like, and he did all of the work, which is where you want your clients, right? Like you want to be able to give them a general direction, but the more of the work that they do, the better it sticks. And so like he wrote this fan fiction and learned actual skills for, and we talked about them, he listed out like 20, 30 things that he learned about how to handle his family and like how they interact with each other. And like how the way that they interact with each other affects the way that like he and his stepsister interact with each other. And like it was literally because I had him write Star Trek fan fiction. And
So cool.
yeah. Because like, especially the things that are like our favorite thing, not just I'm into this, but this is my favorite thing. Like a lot of the time, those things are part of our worldview anyway. Like my favorite TV show of all time is The West Wing, and I think in West Wing quotes. Like a good show to watch if you're trying to store away one-liners for clients to remember, because it is just a show of nothing but incredible one-liners. But like it's almost part of my worldview. Like when I'm feeling disconnected with myself, I watch The West Wing, and I feel more like myself if I've been marathoning it for a couple hours. I low-key suspect that Aaron Sorkin, the guy that wrote it, has ADHD, because the one thing that I have found that connects everybody I know that is really into the works of Aaron Sorkin is we all have ADHD. Like I have 4 or 5 friends. Well, I know 5 people, me included. So 4 friends that are all really into Aaron Sorkin, and literally all of us have ADHD.
Did he write Network?
He wrote The Social Network.
Or The Social Network?
Yeah. So The Social Network, Moneyball, A Few Good Men, The Newsroom, The West Wing. And then before he like got famous, he also had Studio 60 on the Sunset Strip and Sports Night.
I think it's The Newsroom. I really loved that show, but had to stop watching it because my wife couldn't handle the people talking over each other. It's not her favorite thing.
Oh,
but
see, like
but
that's so
it's
satisfying to an
so
AD
much.
brain.
Yeah. Right, because you can get the pace, you can track, and it's yeah.
Yeah,
um so the uh yeah, it's such a powerful statement, like that the things that we love, like our favorite things, they become part of our worldview. And I mean, um that's pretty powerful. Because that that shapes our decisions and the way we live our life. um and so you're really entering into someone's world when
yeah,
you engage, or um and i I think, like we've talked about, like, limited time. I think whether we're therapists, or we're just a friend, or family member, or a parent, we can't become an expert to connect with our person, our loved one, because they have years or decades or hours of a head start on diving deep into this stuff. We're never going to
yeah.
catch up. um
No, I
but
tried to teach my wife how to play Magic the Gathering, and it's the number one thing that she says, because I have this like encyclopedic knowledge of Magic the Gathering cards. Like I can identify from sight and tell you exactly what they say, like what the actual card itself does from just the name, for like over 10,000 cards.
Whoa.
And like, imagine trying to learn how to play that game from somebody like me.
It's just not fair. But being curious,
Yes.
being curious. um I
And
don't
that's
need
the
to
number.
know everything, uh but I want to know, like, why do you love it so much? Why is
Yeah.
it so important to you?
And that's exactly what it is. And I mean, it's sort of even the essence of geek therapy, like what you just described, like the assumption, the very, I think, well-grounded assumption that if you're into this, it's meaningful to you. Like if you're this into it, and showing curiosity about it, and making people feel like it's okay to love what they love. Like that's a huge thing that frees people up in therapy, is like when they talk about like, oh, I'm really into the webcomic Homestuck. And I'm like, oh, who's your favorite character? Tell me about that.
Mhm.
Like I don't go, what's a webcomic? I don't go, what's Homestuck? I am conversational about the webcomic Homestuck. I've never read it, but a lot of people are into it. And so I've picked up things. And like making people feel like it's okay to be them. Like that is the number one piece of feedback that I personally have gotten in therapy. Like when I do my termination session with a client, I ask what has been the most, like what have been some of the most helpful things that I have done so far.
Mhm.
The number one, and like number two is so far away by comparison. My number one thing is that I made people feel like it was okay to be who they were, and that there was something inherently valuable about them. And like that's like such a huge part of it, is like not shaming them, not using the things that they love as an excuse to like check out or not try to understand them,
Mm.
but saying like, okay, this is important to you, please tell me more about it, teach me about it.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. The, um, I, I that'd be a great place to end, but I want to hold on to you for a few more minutes, Adam.
Sure.
You mentioned a little bit about ADD, and being treated for it. I haven't had uh, uh, a therapist on yet to talk about ADD. So could you share a little bit more, if for listeners, if they're a friend or family member uh, of someone who has ADD, or even a listener who has ADD, or isn't sure if they have it? Could you say a little bit more about that topic?
Oh, for sure, this could be its own separate podcast.
Yeah, I
Like
might have to have you back.
yeah, oh man, coming back and talking for an hour about ADD, or it's just all called ADHD now for anybody that's like
okay.
interested in
Thank
that, because you have three different kinds. You have ADHD, predominantly inattentive, ADHD predominantly hyperactive, and ADHD combined presentation, which is elements of both. That's a clarification, because when I talk about ADHD, people immediately assume that I'm talking about the hyperactive presentations, the H in the ADHD. So just wanted to clarify that. So ADHD is an extremely complex disorder, and like most diagnoses, we tend to describe it by the symptoms and not by the causes, which makes it get a little bit muddy. But it is, in general, I mean, the word flibbertigibbet comes to mind. I am a self-described flibbertigibbet. I am late to everything. I cannot remember what I was saying if I get interrupted. I will not be able to focus on things that are super urgent just because they're boring. Like, the urgency is not enough. I'm so behind in my notes right now at my community mental health job. I, in contrast, can get sucked into doing things that I am interested in for hours and hours and hours. The number of times that I'm like, oh God, I thought it was 9, it's 1 a.m. and I really need to go to bed.
That's how you memorize those 10,000 cards.
Yeah, I mean, for real, like, it's, so if it's my primary hobby, and so that, yeah, that one takes precedent. Like, when my brain is like idle, I am trying to figure out new strategies, and, you know, if this card does this and that way that it interacts with this, and it's just like such an incredibly complex game, and they create new cards faster than you can learn what the old ones did. So it's just infinite. But yeah, I mean, I would say that's a good analysis. A huge chunk of the time, if it's 1 a.m. and I thought it was 9, it's because I've been doing Magic the Gathering stuff. So looking at it from a neurological standpoint, and even this is a little bit contested because very few things are localized to just one part of the brain. This idea that, like, oh, depression lives here, self-esteem lives here, that type of thing, like, that's not accurate. All of these things are so, like, incredibly interactive with each other. But in general, the functions that live in the prefrontal cortex, so executive function, this is emotional regulation, ability to recognize and pick up on social cues. It's where working memory lives. That's the, you know, if somebody reads off a phone number and you can repeat the phone number in your head, it's being stored in your working memory. You can think of it sort of like the RAM in a computer. It's where forward thinking, like if you have to plan something 2 or 3 weeks out, that's where that takes place. Most importantly, and I don't know if this is going to sound like it's the most important thing for anyone that's not a therapist, but most importantly, it's also where self-awareness lives, especially in regards to bodily awareness. So this feeling, and I like hone in on this because it's a very common thing for people with ADHD to not know what they want, to forget to eat, and because they don't recognize that they're hungry, or they overeat because they don't recognize how crappy eating too much is making them feel. Their identity feels very fluid or downright non-existent to them because they literally like can't consciously contact these pieces of themselves. And one of the reasons that I like doing Geek Therapy is it's a good way to help people that struggle with things like that. It's like, oh, well, I know what you're like because look at the stuff that you're really into. And like helping them sort of reverse engineer those identity components from that because they don't have the self-awareness a lot of the time to just identify it right off the bat.
Mm-hmm.
And as a therapist, that like our ability to sense what is happening in our body is a huge part of being able to deal with depression and anxiety. Like when we talk about grounding techniques, like that is what the grounding technique does, is it puts you in touch with the present experience as opposed to the ones that are happening in your head. It is shocking the change in people that have ADHD that start taking medication for it. It's night and day. Like I literally, I'm having to like curtail what I'm about to say. I'm trying to summarize it because this is something I could talk about for a really long time. But it's like the muscles in their face are different. Like they're more expressive. They aren't rocking back and forth. They're just like their movements are either more smooth or they're actually still. The like micro expression stuff that you didn't even know was missing shows up all of a sudden. Like it's incredible. And I say all of that to say, like, if I'm not talking about it in the abstract and trying to give practical stuff to people that have loved ones with ADHD, or even people that have ADHD and haven't had a lot of this explained to them, look up what the prefrontal cortex does and start from there, because like that's the part that's not fully online. Like all of the functions that happen in the prefrontal cortex, people with ADHD are going to struggle with. The big problem that people with ADHD run into, and this is, even my clients think that they're this way, which is really sad. They get labeled lazy and unmotivated because ADHD affects your organizational capacities, but leaves a lot of your intellectual capacities intact. And so it appears from the outside as though you have the ability to do the thing and you're just choosing not to. But what it is it's, with my clients, I refer to it as the invisible wall. Sometimes there's this invisible wall between you and the thing that you need to do, and you can't explain it to people that have never experienced it. It's just like, I know that I need to get off of my bed and go and work on my homework right now. And no matter how much I know I need to do that, I cannot get myself to actually do it. Which is executive dysfunction, which is like the primary symptom of ADHD. And so if you have ADHD, or you are the parent, or God help you, the spouse of somebody that has ADHD, look at the functions of the prefrontal cortex and figure out ways to externalize them. So I have this cube. So if it was just like a clock where I had to set a timer and I was having a really bad executive function day, I probably wouldn't use it. But this is so easy. All I do is I take whatever I want the timer to be and I turn that face up. And you can see that when I did that, it automatically set the timer. It blinks red. When it gets closer to the time being out, it starts blinking faster so that there is a visual cue that you need to wrap up whatever you're doing. It beeps in this extremely obnoxious and intrusive way. And this thing got me through grad school because just having an easy way where to set a timer that has like a visual cue, like I externalized the part of my brain that's responsible for tracking time. Because if you ask the average person how many minutes have passed since we started a conversation, they'll usually be able to get it somewhat precise. They'll at the very least be able to say 15, 30, 45, but like literally like I said before, it can be 9 p.m. in my brain, and I look at the clock and it's 1 a.m. and I have no idea how that happened. So this helps with the time blindness stuff. One of the functions of the prefrontal cortex is coming up with strategies for how to accomplish a task. So you'll notice a lot of the time you'll give somebody with ADHD instructions on what to do. Like, I need you to do this. And it seems like they're ignoring you because they just don't do it. But the part of the brain that's supposed to take the end result and reverse engineer the steps to get there, that lives in the prefrontal cortex too. And so the brain doesn't do it as easily. So in grad school, what I learned how to do was I learned how to, I made, for every section, I had to do this with my integrative paper, which, to those of you that did not graduate from the exact program that I graduated from. Did you graduate from Western?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. I knew that you worked there. So yeah, for people that didn't graduate from our exact program, the integrative paper is like a 75-page, essentially, thesis on what we think is a good working model for integrating counseling with our spiritual beliefs. Like, who do we think God is? Big questions. Who do we think God is? What's the role of grace and forgiveness? How does that apply to people that aren't necessarily Christians? How do we, what are the universal things we believe to be true about mental health that apply even when the person doesn't have this particular faith tradition? And it's basically like this summary of everything that we've learned up until that point, boiled down into a 75-page paper. Imagine having ADHD and having to do a 75-page paper on something that abstract. I did it in 9 days. Don't do that. Anybody that goes to Western that's listening to this, dear God, don't do that. I did pass though. So the thing that I did that allowed me to get it done in the 9 days, because did put it off too long. I went through and I laid out the exact structure of the paper. Like, I did the title headers, and for each section where I envisioned that there would be a paragraph break, I did a thesis sentence for each paragraph. And I created an extremely detailed framework to compensate for the fact that my brain doesn't naturally make those the same way that a neurotypical brain does. A intervention for kids that seems to be really helpful. I learned about this from Reddit. By the way, Reddit, excellent resource for learning more about a diagnosis that you either have or that a loved one has. For every major mental health diagnosis, there is a Reddit page for it. And there's so much good information. It also helps you learn a lot about the experiences of those people, like what a day-to-day thing looks like. Also, if you can get on that disorder's TikTok, so that you can start getting TikTok videos about that disorder. You'd be surprised how many clients have come in self-diagnosing because the TikTok algorithm told them that they had a disorder and they were right. Because it's just picking up on patterns. It's like everybody else that searches for these things or is into these things has this disorder, so you probably do too. But yeah, so an intervention that I learned from Reddit, and you can extrapolate this to a lot of different areas, because again, externalizing the functions of the prefrontal cortex. Her 6-year-old son, every time it would come time to get ready for school, she'd say, okay, go and get dressed, and then we'll leave as soon as you're dressed. And without fail, they would be 20, 30 minutes late to school because this kid would show up to the front door every time missing an important article of clothing. He'll be wearing rain boots, raincoat, shirt his mom set aside for him, no pants. Or he'll have forgotten his coat. or when he went to put on his pants and took off his shoes, he accidentally took off only one sock, and so now he only has one sock.
Mm-hmm.
And every single morning took like 3 or 4 attempts to get this kid out the door, and mom was having to wake him up like an hour early to make sure that they weren't late for school. And so what she did was brilliant. I loved this so much. She took a picture of him fully clothed, went to a Office Depot or whatever, had the image blown up, taped it to the front door, and at the bottom it just says, "Do you look like this right now?" So he can't visualize in his head what he's supposed to look like. So what his mom did, and this was so smart, is she externalized it. She showed him, this is what you're supposed to look like right now. So he can look down, look at himself and be like, well, the kid in the picture's wearing pants. And
I
then,
need pants.
right, I need pants.
Externalizing
Yeah.
functions.
Yeah.
So good. Yeah. We got to talk more. But we're running low on time. As we wrap things up for today, Adam, any next steps for listeners, or anything, any last things you want to share about Geek Therapy or ADD?
Yeah. I think that the big thing with Geek Therapy that I just like keep coming back to over and over again is approaching, especially from the perspective of a loved one, approaching this thing that they love as though it's an essential part of them, because it is, else they wouldn't love it so much. And like not shaming them for it, not being satisfied with not understanding any of it. Like one of the biggest things that contributes to the isolation is not that they know these things or they are into this and people can't comprehend the experience. It's that the aversion that a lot of people have to learning more about it makes them feel like it's not okay to love what they love, but they love it anyway. So if they're going to do it, they have to do it by themselves. And so as much as you can, like being even a small part of the process, like you don't have to be a professional Yu-Gi-Oh player, but if your kid's into Yu-Gi-Oh, learn how to play the game. You don't have to be good at it. They'll just be happy you're trying. Like treat these things as though they can be understood, and you probably can understand them, because everything is, this is going to sound so Portland postmodern, but like everything's kind of representative of everything else. Like if people are really into like, you know, the things like when I am buying and selling magic cards, not to make money, but just because that's the way that I get the more expensive ones on a community mental health salary. Like I didn't realize that I was learning about the stock market until I got really into it. And all of a sudden I'm like, these people are talking about like return of investment and like long-term growth potential and all of these things. I'm like, these are magic cards. And then they had actual people that were like Wall Street stockbrokers that were showing up on the subreddit dedicated specifically to the financial side of Magic the Gathering and saying like, yeah, like if you know what a good card is and you buy a lot of them at their low price and you sell them at their high price, like in general, Magic the Gathering sets actually outdo the big indexes in the stock market. Like if you own one of every card from a particular set of Magic the Gathering, it's actually a better financial investment than investing in any of the big indexes, just based on past growth. And so like with something that me and my dad connected on a lot was I was really into the series Mass Effect. sci-fi, Star Wars minus the Force kind of vibe to it. Like literally, that was more or less what it was.
Another anime?
Sorry, that's a video game franchise.
Video.
One of the best written of all time. It won so many writing awards. So my dad was a pilot and was really into space. Like he took me to space camp when I was young. And so when I was explaining to him like what the Mass Effect was, like the thing in the game that the game is named after, which is this sort of, not to go into too much detail, but it's a sort of like physical property of the specific molecule where it reduces the mass of an object when it has an electrical charge run through it, which is what allows them to travel faster than light. My dad he was not a gamer. And he thought that was like the coolest thing. He was like, because he just sat there and he was thinking like, if that really did exist, this is what it would be like in this area. And this is how it would change space exploration. And he's like, so do they use like weapons with this as well? And I'm like, they do. And he's like, oh my God, that's so cool. And he was like geeking out about it with me. He didn't know any of this stuff. Like he had no idea, like he had no interest in playing this game with me, but he was into space. He was into aeronautics. And so he found something to connect with me on.
Yeah, connected with his passions and expertise.
Right. And treating all of these things as though if you search hard enough, you can connect with somebody on these things. Like, and even if you can't, even if you have difficulty with it, like they will appreciate the fact that you're trying. Yeah. Like at the very least, they will feel like it's okay to love what they love. And that loving that thing is not a thing that discourages relationship, which is what a lot of geeks struggle with.
Yeah.
And then ADHD stuff. Oh, sorry. No,
yeah.
You go ahead.
There are a number of things that I'm a geek about. I have some people near and dear to my heart that are definitely into these what we think of as geeky things. And so this has been a lot of fun, Adam, having this conversation with you. If people want to learn more about your work as a counselor, or maybe even work with you if they're in Washington State, how do they contact you? How do they get a hold of you?
So the best way to get a hold of me is, and if you remember nothing else, remember Fircrest, FIRCRESTBH.com. My name is Adam Garrett. You find me on there. It'll give you all of the contact info that you need. I can do in-person visits as long as you are vaccinated or willing to wear a mask. And you are in the Vancouver, Washington area, or are willing to commute to Vancouver. I think I'm a pretty good therapist, but I don't think anybody's commuting from Seattle to come see me in person. I do have openings right now, and probably will by the time this podcast airs, because I'm just getting started in private practice. But if you have a nerd in your life, where you are that nerd that all of this sounds like it would be appealing for, accepting new clients.
Awesome.
And then if you wanted to learn more about Geek Therapy in general, or you wanted to do like some self-explorative stuff, if you either don't have the money, the time, or any other resource to do therapy, then let me find the website real quick. There is a good website for this. Okay, so the website, if you wanted to learn more about this, is geektherapeutics.com. They actually have a lot of content for people that, even if you're not a therapist, but you just are a geek and you wanted to learn more about how to use this in your own life, or if you're just like a friend or spouse of somebody that's a geek, like they have a lot of material that is written to that audience. Yeah, you can definitely check that out. If you're a therapist, and I highly recommend looking into this, you can get an unbelievable amount of continuing education credits. They're all like accredited and everything. It's like $400 a year, and you get access to all of the modules where you can learn at your own pace. And I'm up to like 50 or 60 CEs.
Wow.
Yeah. It's an insane, it's a very, very good deal. Like
you're going deep into it.
Yeah.
Adam, as is your pattern.
Yeah.
That's awesome. So, thank you again for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me. And